everyone, my name is Anne-Marie Colombo. I'm a Cybersecurity Solution Advisor at SAP, working in the Office of the CIO. I am focused on cybersecurity, and this session is called Security by Design and Default. So here's the agenda today. We're going to talk about common security challenges generally and in SAP systems, and a little bit about where to start to get into how do you find more information on how to protect your SAP system, what tools are available from SAP, and what tools do you already have today. My background is in identity and access management, so we will spend some time talking about hybrid solutions from SAP that also work with third-party identity and access management solutions that you may have already in your environment. We'll talk about threats and vulnerabilities and how to monitor that environment, and we'll do a demo of enterprise threat detection and wrap it up with a summary. So if we look at some common challenges from a general security perspective, the Verizon data breach report is a great resource. The link is at the bottom of this screen if you'd like to go and get more information, which I recommend you do. This report has been coming out for the last 13 years. And it does have some very detailed industry information. It's very long. You can click through it online, though. And you can look at it by industry and get an idea of the kind of threats and attacks that are in your industry and that you could be faced with. But they also summarize the findings, and that's what we're seeing here. So most hackers are financially motivated. 37% of the hacks used stolen or credentials that were obtained. Either they were internal threat actors or they were using the credentials that were valid credentials. Most breaches came from hacking, although 75% included hacking, errors, and misuse. So if you look at the overall picture, there's a lot of errors and misuse that come into play besides the 50-some% from hacking. 70% of attacks are from external actors, 30% are from internal actors, and 55% are criminal organizations. Victims are mostly large enterprises, and 58% of those enterprises suffered personal data being compromised. So this is an area that is important to look at. And when we talk about identity access management, we'll talk about multi-factor authentication, which is something that we recommend be put in place to stop the 37% stolen and used credentials. But looking at the SAP system, this can be challenging for an organization because you have two different worlds. You have the IT infrastructure world, which typically have the folks that focus on the network security, the router security, the firewall security. And then you have the SAP Basis team that's focused on Basis and SAP. And typically people in the past have heard SAP security and thought roles, authorizations, but it's much more than that. But the difficulty comes because these two organizations don't speak the same language. They don't focus on the same areas. They definitely report up through different organizations. So there's not a lot of collaboration here in terms of trying to figure out how to work together. From an SAP perspective, the challenges we see, which are sometimes handled by the IT security team, the big thing we see is patch management and how to get patches applied in a timely manner to your SAP system. This does usually involve working with the IT security team and can be a challenge if they don't understand the SAP system, the SAP security patches that are available. These are available on Patch Tuesday, the second Tuesday of the month from SAP. And we do have a webinar on Wednesdays with ASUG that explain the patches in detail and allow you to ask questions. So this is an area that requires focus and some coordination with IT security and the Basis team. Unencrypted communications is another challenge in the SAP world. So making sure if you're an ECC customers that you have enabled SNC, and from a web perspective that TLS is enabled. Interfaces, RFCs, and API security is important, and it's important to pay attention to those from an SAP perspective. And then backup and recovery is an area that many people miss because it doesn't seem like a security issue, but it really is, because if you do have to isolate your SAP system or take it down, it's important to know and to have tested backup and recovery procedures, not only for security events, but also for disaster recovery. How do you bring that SAP system back up and running? Have you put in place a backup and recovery plan, and have you tested that plan? We find that some organizations have not tested their plan. And I know of at least one instance where the SAP system, because they didn't have a backup and recovery plan, the SAP system was down for 2 weeks, which impacted production and made it difficult for them to produce product and bill customers. So you don't want that to happen. The SAP system is typically where your most critical data and functions for the organization are run. And then the last thing, which is not a small thing, is configuration issues. So making sure that your SAP system is configured properly. You can get a security baseline template from Solution Manager's configuration validation tool and use that security baseline to run configuration validation against, to make sure that your configuration baseline, your security configuration baseline, is set and in place. Some of the other areas that are available from an SAP perspective to get you started are going to the support portal, which the link is at the bottom here of the screen, and looking at the security operations map. And if we look at this, if you look at this on the support portal, you can click through these boxes and it gives you a little bit of information so that you understand best practices in these specific areas and tools that are available. Solution Manager comes as part of the maintenance contract, and so you have some things that are available today through Solution Manager that can be used for security. And then there are licensed products as well. But if you look at the layers here, starting with environment, that's typically the infrastructure area. This information is for your infrastructure team so that they can set up the SAP environment properly with network segmentation, zones, and so forth. The operating system databases all set up so that they don't impact your SAP system, because the SAP system is generally running on top of this environment at that system level as we work our way up the stack here. And there are security configurations that need to be in place from an SAP for SAP. The code, SAP custom code, should be run through a code analyzer tool, like a code vulnerability analyzer from SAP that looks at code and test code. It's an automated static application security testing tool that looks at code and finds vulnerabilities against the OWASP top 10 and other vulnerabilities that are out there, so that you find those early before you issue that code out to production. And you have to pay an expensive pen tester to find things that would have been found easily if you were running an automated code scanner like CVA. Security monitoring and forensics, we have tools that we'll talk about later. Enterprise Threat Detection, that's a licensed tool, but there's also things in Solution Manager you can put in place to do monitoring and alerting off the environment. We'll spend time at the application layer talking about the identity access management environment, but custom code's another thing through Solution Manager. You can find custom code that you no longer use, and that should be deleted from the environment because it does represent a security risk if it's hanging around and nobody's using it. From a process perspective, SAP has some best practices around regulatory process and compliance, data privacy and protection. We also have some licensed products in this area, some newer products. And then audit and risk management. Risk assessments are very important. We have ways to automate that through some of our tools that we provide. And then if you look at the top layer from an organization standpoint, you want to make sure that you have a security awareness training program that includes your SAP system, security governance around your SAP system, and then you're regularly doing risk assessments so you know the status of what your SAP system is. And as I said, best practices can be found on the support portal. as well as some capabilities and out of Solution Manager. So if we look at some of those, the early watch alert report in the security chapter is an area that definitely should be run on a regular basis. Most customers run this every week. Security optimization service is a report that gets into even more detail than just the authorizations that come up within the early watch. And it can be run on your own. You can have some services mentioned on the right side of the screen here from Max Attention, or you can have a consulting service, or you can run this yourself. It gives you much more detail on what's happening in your environment from a security perspective. System recommendations gives you recommendations on the security notes that apply to your particular environment and SAP system. And then I mentioned already the security monitoring, alerting, and configuration validation. The services on the right side are offered from, we have a Center of Excellence for Security Optimization through Max Attention or through a DBS consulting engagement. There's also a 2-week assessment for security and data privacy. So, and a data privacy workshop. Both are about 2 weeks. And out of these 2 sessions, you can get a roadmap for security or for data privacy, some things that you can do using some of the tools that you have today, but also putting in a plan in place for your future. As you move to S/4HANA, if you are not on S/4HANA, it's always a good idea to look at role optimization, authorizations, the simplification guide that is out with transactions and authorization objects. And we do have services in this area as well. Again, this is a consulting engagement that's available from SAP. Very important to look at your roles. We have a number of organizations that had set their roles up 5 years ago and never touched them. And when they moved to S4, they try to keep the same roles. Not a good idea, because many of those roles may have gone away. You don't use them anymore. And not that they've gone away from SAP, but they may have gone away that you don't use them anymore, and need to be looked at just to optimize them, to make sure you still are using those roles and that they're relevant. There are, as I said, the simplification tables from a transaction and role perspective should be looked at, and sometimes it might be helpful to have somebody come in and look at this with you. So if we get into the identity access management, it's difficult sometimes, because if you don't do this right, you do have risk in your organization where you are opening the doors potentially to hackers, to stolen credentials, to fraud and data misuse. So getting access in access controls in place is very important, and that's in 3 areas: authentication, authorization, and accountability. So knowing who did what inside your SAP system after you proved who they were to get in and gave them the right amount of access. Most of this is becoming more important as we get into data privacy regulations, because it is a requirement that only certain people see certain data. And so putting additional access controls like UI masking on top, so that people only see certain parts of the data, but not the full set of data, because they don't need to do their job, is important. But again, it's important when you look at a hybrid landscape. You've got on-premise, you've got cloud, you've got mobile coming in. So your attack surface is much bigger than it may have been in the past. And if we look at this, the way we're going to look at this today is across the whole identity lifecycle management. So how do you simplify access for people coming in, give them access to be able to do their job very quickly, automate the administration, meaning don't give them too much access, check segregation of duties, and as you give out and provision the roles, so you're not giving them too much access, give them some self-service capabilities to change access, get more access to new systems, and then when they leave, how do you deprovision, and then how do you monitor what they're doing while they're in the environment, and as well as threats that may be coming in that look like legitimate users. So from a functional standpoint, if you think about onboarding an employee, they typically would come in through SAP, ERP, HCM, the HR system from SAP, or SuccessFactors, our cloud solution, or another authoritative source. The way that SAP's identity and access management tools work is that we provide the capability of mixing and matching SAP and non-SAP through the fact that we have industry standard protocols like SCIM from an identity management perspective, system cross-domain identity management, or SAML for the authentication piece, so that you can use a corporate third-party corporate identifier for a third-party corporate identity provider for SAML, or so those protocols are provided where you can mix and match with SAP or non-SAP. So if somebody comes in from SuccessFactors, they will trigger a workflow as they're onboarded, which will call up identity management. SAP Identity Management is shown on the screen. That's a centralized identity management tool that allows the user's entitlements, roles, and privileges to be set up, permissions for the applications that they need to have access for to do their job. In order to not give them too much access, the workflow will then kick off the access control or identity access governance tool from SAP on the cloud side to check to make sure that they're not getting too much access. And segregation and duty checks can be handled at this time. And then the manager can be notified if there's any exceptions that need to be approved before providing and provisioning out that user with their roles, and so that they can get access. Equally important is deprovisioning from the system. So being able to delete the user and all their privileges in an automated fashion is very important from a security perspective. We had the FBI come in 2019 in our security pre-conference to Sapphire, and they talked about the fact that they were seeing a lot of ex-employees that still had access to get back into the system, and they were committing fraud. So it is a real security and fraud risk if you don't deprovision employees. On this slide, we're going to start with a discussion on authentication, which is represented by the gold arrows on the slide. So the user comes in, they are coming into the SAP Cloud Platform, authenticating against the Identity Authentication Service, which can also look at an LDAP solution such as Azure, Active Directory, or any corporate third-party provider. Then they will obtain a SAML assertion and use that to get into the SAP Cloud Solution or back to the on-premise third-party applications or the SAP applications. Those can also, the Identity Authentication Service from SAP along with SAP Single Sign-On can support not only SAML, but X.509 or Kerberos protocol as well for authentication. It also supports setting up a risk-based authentication, which can include multi-factor authentication. So knowing who's in your system, and as they come in, their IP address, the time of day, contextual information that you can set up to decide whether to let them in or to force a multi-factor authentication. The blue arrows on this screen represent the authorization process and the monitoring process. So you set up the roles and authorizations in the onboarding procedure that we looked at previously. So the controls from an identity management would flow up to identity access governance, which would look at the cloud and decide from a risk mitigation perspective if there's any problems there, if anything needed to be addressed, if there were any access violations. Identity access governance would be able to highlight that. So, and then the threat monitoring is the piece that's monitoring and looking at who's doing what within the SAP system, and also monitoring for threats. There's over about 80 or so threat detection patterns that come with Enterprise Threat Detection that can report on anomalous user behavior. So if somebody's behaving in a funny way, they'll be alerted based on the monitoring capabilities of enterprise threat detection. So let's look into that a little bit deeper. So if you look at blind spots within your system, typically the network folks get real good visibility at the network router level. There's lots of tools out there, but getting visibility into the application is more difficult. So what data is in the critical? What is the critical data? What data is in that's important from a mission critical perspective for your business? Typically that's bills of materials, that's marketing data, customer data, employee data, may also be PII data that you are under regulatory requirements to keep private, your supplier data, financial data, that's typically sitting in your SAP system. And your IT infrastructure team is focused on the email system, the file, the cloud drives, and those areas. The SAP systems are typically a black box that they don't really know what's going on. And this is an area that as we see the IT security folks get more into threat hunting, they want to find those blind spots, blind spots, and figure out how they get visibility. And since it is a black box to them, the problem with this, of course, is that that's where most of the critical data is. And that's why we developed Enterprise Threat Detection. Enterprise Threat Detection takes in all of the SAP logs and correlates those logs. It's a HANA big data solution, so it runs an in-memory database that does very high volume processing against these attack detection patterns to see if there's any threats happening real time within the SAP system, and then alerts based on those attack detection patterns to see to either the security analysts so that they can look further into the SAP system, or they can send an alert out to a security incident and event management tool like Splunk, ArcSight, QRadar. This helps make those tools more, so what happens is you cut down on the number of false alarms because you have an alert from the SAP system sent to the Splunk system. Splunk can look now what's happening with that user. And if there's alerts happening on the Splunk side, they actually can send that back to the enterprise threat detection system too. And now you have alerts on both sides, and that helps narrow down what, that this is a real alert. It's not a false alarm. There's really a problem here. So there is a forensic lab within enterprise threat detection, but you can send the information over to the Splunk system and use Splunk at that infrastructure level and enterprise threat detection at the SAP level to get visibility into what's happening. So if we look a little bit more into this, we can see why enterprise threat detection gives additional information. So if you have a disgruntled developer, for instance, who understands SC80 and SM59 to discover RC connections into the productive system, he can pivot into that productive system. He can use the RC to get in that system and elevate his privileges, change his password, elevate his privileges to the manager, and then he can change the vendors by running the SAP transaction FK02 and then pay the vendor with F53, pay himself basically. And so what does that look like under the covers? Here you see that all these bits, all these actions updated these different logs within the SAP system. There are 10 to 12 different logs inside the SAP systems. And enterprise threat detections understands the RC connections, the transactions, the authorization objects, basically the nuances of the SAP system better than the SIM tools like Splunk, QRadar, ArcSight. It's difficult to get those tools. They would have to be changed constantly to, they would have to be enhanced to understand what's happening within the SAP system. And then that would change, that might change. The security audit log might change. So they'll have to reprogram and reconvert that. So it's much easier to use enterprise threat detection to monitor the SAP system and send the SIM tool the information it needs to do further investigation. So I'm going to show you a demo now of enterprise threat detection. It's going to be a brute force attack and sensitive data view. So People forget their passwords. They go on vacation, they forget the password. But if all of a sudden you have a big spike in forgotten passwords, like it sets off an alert through the automated attack detection patterns with enterprise threat detection. You know that you might have an active attack going on, and this may not be visible at the network level, again, because it's happening at the application level. And so this would highlight the users, terminals, key events, any sensitive data accessed or downloaded. And you could look at this, which is what we're going to do in a minute, through enterprise threat detection, and then send, the alert would also be sent over to the SIM tool, so you can look at what else is happening with that user under the covers from a network perspective. This is the Fiori tile screen that comes up with enterprise threat detection so that you can navigate your way through the tool. It is very user-friendly based on Fiori. So you see at the top, you have monitoring, system monitoring, security notes, patterns. You have various reports and charts that you can look at to understand where you are from a attack detection perspective. If we look at alerts and investigations, and this line of tiles gives more information around the open alerts that are there, the threat situation in the last hour, and any open investigations that might be there. There are some screens here there's some tiles here that you don't see that are related to log learning. And those are administrative functions only. So you can set up the Fiori tiles just like you always set up Fiori tiles based on authorization. So I see here with the threat situation the last hour that I have one alert. So I'm going to go into that alert and look at what's happening here. So we see that this is a brute force attack. The alert number is high up there, and then that we've gone over 891 over the threshold of 100 on this Y13-222. We see the initiator machine is this WDF character. And if we look at the distribution of these attempted logons, we see all these different usernames. They are anonymized because we do anonymize the users based on the fact that we are conscious of GDPR. But you see that it's always the same host name trying all these different anonymized users trying to get in here. So now we look at, it's going to show here the type of attack, whether it's confidentiality, integrity, or availability. And now we're moving into the forensic lab. So here we are in the forensic lab. If you look on the left, we have a path that we're going to look at. But first, let's go back a couple hours, so that we can see what was happening a couple hours here. So here's the path on the left. We see that we're looking at events in the security audit log. We're looking at whoever initiated those events, and then we're looking at two specific patterns: user logon failures and brute force attack. You see that where we went way over the threshold, the red line is the threshold. We did 891 instead of 100. In the middle here, we can drill down into more information to get an idea of what's going on. You can activate the alerts here. You can deactivate them. There's different views that you can take of the system through these various options that we're seeing here. So right now we're looking at the failed logons by system, user, and host name. Here you see where the attacker was flying under the radar and trying by making 6 attempts per username to hide his actions. And at some point, he did spike up at the beginning. So he's trying to fly under the radar, but we can look a little bit deeper into this by adding another path or filter to the system. So here we're going to look at what he was doing, WDF, see exactly what he was doing in terms of, we see 1,400 events that he started within our SAP system. So we want to dig into that a little bit more and see exactly what he was doing. Here's our semantic events here. User logons are 14 of those. So if we drill into that, add that to the filter, we can see that he was in that Y13-222 12 times. So we want to drill a little bit further there. We want to look at now whether where those user logon failures were. And you see that there were 297 of those against the Y13-222 system. So we can look a little bit further to see if he was able to look at any data. And he looked at the data. We're going to see if he was able to look at the data through an RFC connection. So here we see there was 14 instances where he was able to look at Y13-222. So we're going to check out the specific function that he ran. And we see here that he was reading a table. So he was able to read data, and it was the security audit log, as you can see there. And now we're going to look at what else happened. Was he able to download any data from the system? So we choose that, and then that's going to change the chart. We see that there were 4 instances of data download. So we'll look a little bit deeper here into the transactions that he ran. We see that he ran SE16 and SM20 against the security audit log again. So, and he was able to download data. You see that there was some data downloaded, 4 instances from the security audit log. So now we're going to look and see whether that was sensitive data. Sensitive data is monitored data. So we're looking at that monitored data. We see that there were 2 instances there and the read access log. And then he was able to look at sensitive data. So how this all happened was through correlation. That's one of the strengths of SAP Enterprise Threat Detection, is the ability to correlate all of the information from all of the SAP logs and also add that historical aspect of it. So looking back 2 weeks, 2 hours, 2 months, whatever you want. But we see here some of the information that was correlated. System ID, the IP address, and here we see the service program, which was the pump plan. So this was a place where some of the confidential data was held, and he was able to access and get in there twice, we see by the count number here. And he searched on the pump 9-15, and you see other parameters here. And here we see that he was able to access some intellectual property, which was the pump plan. So this is an example of all the information that's available, and it can be correlated with SAP Enterprise Threat Detection. From a vulnerability perspective, it's also important to look at your code custom code before it gets put out in the production system. So from a vulnerability perspective, SAP offers SAP Code Vulnerability Analyzer, which is a static application security testing tool that automates the testing through your source code, looking and scanning for OS top 10, SQL injections and different types of attacks on your code, on your ABAP code before it gets put into production. This is much less expensive than hiring a pen tester to find these type of things that are fairly easy to find if you do have a code scanner like CVA. It has been integrated into the Fortify Security Center for folks that use Fortify, but you can use it on its own as well. It's also can be kicked off through the ABAP test cockpit. So that's another tool available to you from a vulnerability perspective to help you to reduce the vulnerabilities in your SAP system. So to summarize, we looked at simplifying the access to get into the system through an automated workflow kicked off by success factors on the onboarding side, going through the identity management, centralized identity management, doing segregation and risk mitigation checks through identity access governance or SAP access control, identity authentication service, and also identity provisioning service run on the SAP Cloud Platform to help with authentication service and also provisioning up to the cloud. And then access control and identity management on-premise tools that also could be used and seamlessly across the SAP environment if you're using all SAP, or you can mix and match, as we talked about earlier, with third-party tools as well. And then the last part is making sure you know who did what within your SAP system, at the same time monitoring for threats. You can do that with SAP Enterprise Threat Detection. So that's what we covered today. We also covered the code vulnerability analysis part to look at vulnerabilities before you put your custom code out. And we talked about some of the things that are available for free from Solution Manager, I should say, as part of Solution Manager. So please, which our Solution Manager is part of your maintenance contract. So utilize your maintenance contract, use the security chapter of your Early Watch service and security optimization service, configuration, validation, get that security template, baseline template put in place, system recommendations to look at patching. And then, if you're SAP Enterprise Support Services customer, look at the Enterprise Support Academy for security value maps, and take advantage of Max Attention for any of the services that are available. And here are some additional links on the products that we talked about today. GRC Solutions gives you a full picture of all of our GRC solutions, including the risk management, audit management that we mentioned earlier. That can be automated as well, help automated your risk management. It supports all the different frameworks, NIST, COSO, COBIT that you might use. Help.sap.com has security guides for every product that SAP has. The Support and Trust Center gives you information on our SOC 2 reports and information on what's happening from the cloud perspective. So it's valuable from a cloud security perspective, and recommend that you look at the Trust Center on a regular basis to get updates on SAP security information from a cloud perspective. So thank you very much for your time. There's some additional sessions that you may be interested in attending. The roadmap on identity access management is IIS 831. Manage identity lifecycle in SAP S/4HANA with SAP Cloud Identity Services, that's Dev 106. Securing the Intelligent Enterprise, we'll get into much more detail on Enterprise Threat Detection, IIS 267. And then we have a really fun cybersecurity roundtable planned, that's IIS 125. And then here's some additional websites that might be helpful. Thank you again for your time.